Yeah, it's, of course, she left for me to talk about the tremendous free transit experiment that's also occurring in Tallinn, Estonia, which I am going to discuss because it impacts on what is a part of my campaign here. And actually, some of the very positive benefits that have come out of the Estonian experiment with free transit, the very popular one now, really have tremendous relevance for Ward 6 and for areas of Toronto like Etobicoke Lakeshore and Scarborough, other outlying areas. On January 1st, 2013, Tallinn, Estonia, the capital of Estonia, became the largest city in the world at the time. I believe it may still be, I could be wrong, but the largest city in the world at the time to implement entirely free, fare-free transit for its residents. So as long as you had a card indicating that you were a resident, you could travel the system for free. And this was, of course, resisted by the right and by, conservative forces in Estonia, but it has now become tremendously popular, sort of akin to what happens with programs like Medicare, for example. Once they are put in place and their benefits are seen and they become widely popular, they become very difficult for the forces of reaction to undo, which is part of the importance of struggling and fighting and working for these kind of seemingly, small stage reforms, is that in a case like this, in a case like free transit, which is much more transformative, which could have real and direct impact on people's lives, the struggle for free transit becomes an essential part of the struggle for a better society and a struggle for a more environmentally sustainable and a decommodified society where we view all of these different services as something that should be entirely public and not something that should be funded through user fees, which is what transit fares essentially are. In Estonia, I think you can find that in the case of Tallinn and the impact it has here for Ward 6 and for Etobicoke Lakeshore, the most dynamic and important result that they noticed in the most pronounced way was that it tied some of the outlying and poorer neighborhoods much more into the fabric, the social, economic, and cultural fabric of Tallinn's day-to-day life. So what happened is that some neighborhoods in Tallinn, which, as we find in outlying neighborhoods in Toronto, which suffered from concentrations of poor housing, high jobless rates, unfortunately a lot of people living in poverty, these neighborhoods became much more engaged with the social fabric of Tallinn, Estonia as a whole. People could come out of their neighborhoods. The cost, here in Toronto, for example, as I noted in a piece I wrote for Rabble on fare-free transit, in Toronto, if I were to go, I'm a total transit user, I don't drive. If I were to take my kids to High Park and back on a non-weekend, because on the weekend there is the family pass, but the rest of the time there's not, and I were to take my kids to High Park and back, I have 3 children, it's a $16.80 round trip. For a lot of people on fixed and lower incomes, that is simply not affordable. It means that they are excluded from things like Shakespeare in the Park. It means they're excluded from free events at Harbourfront. It means they are excluded from going to look for jobs in other parts of the city often. And when you have a system that does not engage every neighborhood into the entire fabric of the city, it promotes the pushing of people living in poverty and the pushing of people on social assistance and people who aren't living on living wages out to neighborhoods, and then keeps them in those neighborhoods in ways that are contrary to what we want to see as a society, the social inclusion that we want to achieve. So I think the first thing that I always like to bring up when I talk about free transit is that it is an essential component of a campaign for real social inclusion. If we have free transit in Toronto, people living in poverty, people on fixed incomes, people on social assistance in neighborhoods like the one we are in right now will be able to be more engaged in the cultural and social life of the city, and will be able to bring to the city their perspectives, their interests, and to become a part of this fabric that many are excluded from as a result of these high costs. You know, there is a counterpoint to that, which is that, and this also happened in Tallinn, which is that the neighborhoods themselves open up to the rest of the city, where what you find is that cultural events will migrate out to neighborhoods that they weren't interested in being in before, in part because people don't want to travel to the neighborhoods. You have to pay. The transit infrastructure may not be all that good. You know, I mean, as part of my campaign for free transit, I'm also tying it to the campaign for, of course, a Waterfront West LRT and LRTs out to neighborhoods that are underserviced. You know, these campaigns all go together. But what has happened in Estonia is that cultural events are starting to spring up in neighborhoods that they simply didn't spring up in before. And this is a really interesting turn of events. And what it shows is, you know, out here in an area like Etobicoke Lakeshore, where you have parks and recreation facilities and areas that are, you know, basically hidden gems, it opens up these areas to events and to, you know, inclusion in the city fabric, in that people will come from other neighborhoods to visit. The likelihood of people making the trip out to Etobicoke Lakeshore would be greatly increased, both with free transit and with things like the Waterfront West LRT. So these are essential matters of social inclusion. I mean, of course, we already talked about the environmental impacts, which are essential, the impact on gridlock, the impact on sort of stepping away from car culture, which is tremendously important. You know, to bring up something in conjunction with what you were talking about, Desmond Tutu, not all that long ago, actually called for the ending of the massive subsidies that governments internationally put into car usage and fossil fuel usage. And he called for a boycott campaign akin to the campaign against apartheid. He said that it is the critical environmental and one of the critical human struggles of our time. And that climate change, of course, is a threat to life on Earth in a very direct way. And there is an incredibly pressing need to move people out of their cars. And when we talk about how this is, of course, as you brought up, one of the first things that happens when you bring up the idea of free transit is people say, well, how are you going to pay for that? I mean, that's crazy talk, right? I mean, one of the things I always like to start by saying is, well, people said it was crazy that we could have free healthcare, you know, and we do. So there are ways that we can achieve this, excuse me, if we make these social priorities. But what I think people don't broadly understand is just how much car culture is subsidized. And in Canada recently, based on studies that came of all places from the International Monetary Fund, that noted radical organization, it turns out that in Canada it's likely to the tune of $26 billion a year that the government subsidizes the fossil fuel usage and subsidizes thereby car usage. And you are that, I mean, $26 billion is a very big reservoir from which we can start to look at ways to shift these subsidies from car usage over to subsidies of public transit instead, as part of a campaign to shift people out of their cars. So I think that that is one place and one source of funding. On my own campaign here, we have in addition been calling for other ways that we would work towards funding free transit, one of which is putting tolls on people entering the city by car by themselves. So I do advocate for that. I do actually think that people who live outside of the boundaries of Toronto who choose to use the resources and roads of the city and who do not want to carpool or use public transit should pay for what I regard as a privilege and not a right. I don't believe that driving alone in your car is a right. I believe that it is a privilege, and I believe it's a privilege that is having a disastrous social and environmental impact, and it's one that we have to start to actively discourage. But beyond that, I also call for things, funding mechanisms like luxury surtaxes on luxury homes, and I do agree with a number of the proposals that were brought in for dedicated funding sources. So I believe that if you have an actual will, a political will, you can find the funding for this. I mean, there is no reason that Estonia is capable, and cities in Poland and in other places in the world are capable of having free transit, and yet somehow the allegedly world-class Toronto is not. It is simply that the political will does not exist. It's simply that people do not, our politicians do not want to talk about these issues and would rather stream it off into talking about long-winded plans to create transit infrastructure without any meaningful way to pay for it in some cases, such as John Tory's not particularly smart plan. So I think that when you are going to talk about fare free transit, and when you are confronted with the inevitable question of how do we pay for it, one of the responses, among all of the responses that I just gave, the other one is that we simply cannot afford to continue to not do it. We do need to make these kind of steps forward in promoting public transit usage. We need to create a better infrastructure and a more inclusive infrastructure for neighborhoods like this one. It is a part of social inclusion. It's a part of fighting for an environmental benefit. And it's an incredibly important step as well towards ongoing campaigns to try to mitigate the effects of ever-increasing inequality. The reality is that we live in an era of tremendous social inequality. And it is these types of user fees, having to pay for transit, having to pay higher user fees for other city programs and rec programs, for example, are the things that impact terribly on the lives of people who are living on non-living wages, people who are being paid poverty wages, people on social assistance, people on fixed incomes. And again, beyond the previous stuff we were talking about when it comes to social inclusion and the environmental benefits, it is a part of our struggle for greater social equality and greater economic inclusion to fight for things like free transit. It's a must, and I believe that it is both directly beneficial to the city as a whole and especially beneficial to neighborhoods like Etobicoke Lakeshore to bring in platforms and to fight for free transit. So thank you very much for everyone for coming out, and I look forward to any questions anyone has. Thank you.